Delegitimizing Israel in Germany and Austria. Past Politics, the Iranian Threat, and Post-National Anti-Zionism by Stephan Grigat. Over the last decade or two, calls for an end to Israel as a Jewish state have become increasingly acceptable, even in the political discourse of the Western mainstream. Although loss of life through terrorist and rocket attacks, particularly the possibility of a future attack by the Iranian regime, is the most imminent threat Israel faces today, its delegitimization as a Jewish state not only presents a serious problem for Israel, but also encourages anti-Semitism globally. The emergence and growth of the delegitimization campaign against Israel is a vital indicator of contemporary anti-Semitism in Europe in general and in the successor states of the National Socialist Germany in particular. An analysis of this phenomenon can contribute significantly to a better understanding of contemporary anti-Semitism. In this essay, I cover 3 points. First, I discuss the delegitimization of Israel and Zionism in Germany and Austria, and outline the relationship between the politics of the past and present criticism of Israel. Second, I discuss the delegitimization of Israel and Austria and Germany in light of the Iranian threat. Third, I offer some thoughts on the theoretical and philosophical justifications of Israel's delegitimization, examining post-nationalism, post-structuralism, and cultural relativism. Prime elements of efforts to delegitimize Israel are specific to the successor states of National Socialist Germany. German and Austrian politicians and scholars tend to avoid direct condemnation of Israeli actions. Because of Germany's and Austria's Nazi past, relatively soft accusations, such as the charge of, quote, using disproportionate force, end quote, instead of calling for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or criticism of Israel's consistent self-defense instead of total denial of the country's right to exist. Israel's consistent self-defense instead of denial of the country's right to exist, are more common there than in other European countries. Nonetheless, there are people on the lunatic fringe, especially among the anti-imperialist left wing, who openly call for the, quote, destruction, end quote, of Israel. In a November 2012 announcement in Vienna, for example, an activist belonging to the Trotskyist group Revolutionary Communist Organization for Liberation demanded that Israel be, quote, annihilated, end quote. However, a more central problem is mainstream magazines and newspapers, as well as people such as columnist Jacob Augstein and Nobel Prize-winning author Günter Grass, the latter who received broad support when he declared Israel to be a, quote, danger for world peace, end quote. Of course, one can find many branches of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement in Germany, and there can be absolutely no doubt that the BDS movement seeks to destroy Israel. Supporters of BDS publicly admit that when they demand solely that Israel end the occupation of the West Bank, it is merely strategic, a strategy aimed at putting an end to Israel once and for all. In Austria, however, the BDS movement is almost non-existent. The first official BDS chapter in Austria was founded in May 2014, and in Germany, BDS is criticized even within the left-wing party Die Linke, which is known to have members of the Bundestag who openly oppose Israel. However, anti-Semitic criticism of Israel in Germany is not limited to extreme left or right-wing groups. Consider the caricature that portrays Benjamin Netanyahu as saying, quote, I need bird poison and poisonous pellets to kill snails, end quote. Meant to evoke the Israeli prime minister's attitude towards the nuclear production talks with the Iranian regime in Geneva, the cartoon employs the classical blood libel image of the Jewish poisoner. The caricature did not appear in the extreme left-wing daily paper, Junge Welt, which expresses anti-Israel views openly, nor did it appear in the Nazi paper, Deutsche Stimme. Rather, it was published in the well-known Badische Zeitung, whose editorial staff defended the cartoonist against accusations of anti-Semitism. Columnist and editor Jakob Augstein exemplifies this point of view. The political analyst Samuel Salzborn, I don't know if that's how you say it in German, I don't know. But, political analyst Samuel Salzborn cautiously but rightly attested that some of Augstein's most obsessive statements on Israel in his column, When in Doubt, Turn Left, published over a period of months in 2011 and 2012, contained a, quote, series of anti-Semitic terms, end quote. But in Germany, Augstein hardly stands alone. His anti-Israel statements correspond to the views of many of his colleagues and of much of the German public. Augstein's view of Israel as a danger for, quote, world peace, end quote, his false depictions and belittling of the anti-Semitic Iranian regime's expressed intention to annihilate Israel, the parallels he draws between Orthodox Israeli Jews and jihad murderers, his labeling of the Gaza Strip as a, quote, camp, end quote, and his mumblings of conspiracy theories, with Israel being behind just about everything, earned him 9th place on the Simon Wiesenthal Center's list of, quote, 2012 top 10 anti-Israel / anti-Semitic slurs, end quote. Yet across the German political spectrum, he was widely defended in the press against accusations of anti-Semitism. Representatives of Die Linke defended him just as strongly as executive committee members of the conservative CDU, the Christliche Demokratische Union, the Conservative Party in Germany. In Frankfurter Rundschau and the Berliner Zeitung, writers speculated about throwing Augstein's critics, such as the journalist Henrik M. Broder, into jail. From Die Tageszeitung to Die Zeit, from the left-wing liberal Süddeutsche Zeitung to the conservative Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, almost no one in the print media seriously discussed the accusations leveled against Augstein by the Simon Wiesenthal Center. One of the few exceptions was Josef Joffa, who rightly contended that it is more condemned today, quote, to call someone anti-Semitic than actually to be anti-Semitic yourself, end quote. The wide-ranging defense of Augstein probably resulted from a feeling on the part of many authors that they had been personally exposed. The statements of the co-owner of one of Germany's most important publishing houses made the anti-Semitic nature of, quote, Israel criticism, end quote, in Germany and Austria even more evident than it already was. When Israel is discussed in post-war Germany and Austria, National Socialist history is always lurking in the background. When discussions point to, quote, Israeli crimes, end quote, the German-Austrian conscience is put to rest. In the end, everyone has some sort of skeleton in the closet, and the Germans are pleased to underscore that they have already dealt with their crimes in an exemplary manner. One utterance by a German historian aptly illustrates what post-Nazi normality means in Germany today. At the anniversary celebrations for the architect Peter Eisenman's Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, with Chancellor Gerhard Schröder of the SPD, wish to be a moment, quote, a monument, quote, people will enjoy visiting, end quote. The historian Eberhard Jäckel said in May 2010, quote, some people in other countries envy the Germans for this monument, end quote. In light of the Citizens Festival at the field of Steli, the Berlin Daily Tagesspiegel was genuinely pleased with the, quote, history of success of the Holocaust Memorial, end quote. What was still being criticized in the 1980s and 1990s by authors such as Wolfgang Port and or Eike Geisel, in hopes that criticism at an early stage would not pervade society as a whole, is what shapes the self-image of the entire German nation today. Varying Paul Celan's verse from the Fugue of Death, quote, death is a master from Germany, end quote, the fitting motto of Germany's self-image today could be, quote, Germany is a master at coping with the past, end quote. To talk about everything but to understand absolutely nothing, that is Vergangenheitsbewältigung in today's Germany. Today, the majority of Germans know what they've reaped from mass murdering European Jews, and how to create politically added value by dealing with Germany's past extermination policies. The more the National Socialist path is dealt with publicly, the easier it is to preach moral behavior to the surviving victims of Hitler's Germany. The more commemorations for murdered Jews, the more tightly you can embrace today's anti-Semites, for example, the Iranian regime. At the beginning of the 1980s, the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin from the Likud party, or Likud. Just to be clear, I'm not an expert on any of these topics, but so just keep that in mind. Let the German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, SPD, know that whoever served as an officer in the War of Annihilation at the Eastern Front should hold his tongue once and for all concerning problems in the Middle East. For the former first lieutenant of the German Wehrmacht, that seems to have fallen on deaf ears. Schmidt is among 26 European ex-politicians who at the end of 2010 wanted to dictate policy to Israel on construction in the West Bank and on how to prevent further armament in the Gaza Strip. Another former officer of the German Wehrmacht stood by his side, former President Richard von Weizsäcker, CDU, who to this day defends his father, Ernst von Weizsäcker, who had been state secretary in the Federal Foreign Office during the Nazi era and was sentenced for crimes against humanity because of his involvement in the deportation of French Jews to Auschwitz. Both Schmidt and Weizsäcker were complicit in starving to death over 1 million people in Leningrad. They fought in the hinterland of the Eastern Front, where the systematic murder of European Jews was perpetrated. Today, as angry, quote, elder statesmen, end quote, they demand sanctions against the very country founded as a reaction to the German crimes. Claiming to have dealt with their own history, they feel justified in dictating behavior to the state of the Shoah survivors and their offspring. Schmidt, who according to Die Zeit is, quote, the most popular German politician in recent history, end quote, openly stated the consequence of this approach for German foreign policy, quote, Germany is not responsible for Israel, end quote. Hence, Schmidt and Weizsäcker, together with an entire squad of former, primarily social democratic, top-ranking politicians, have pleaded for, quote, sanctions, end quote, and, quote, concrete measures, end quote, not against the Iranian regime or the Iranian regime's allies Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah, that aim to annihilate Israel, but against the Jewish state. In any case, that stance is more honest than the policy of Schmidt's successor, Angela Merkel, who rhetorically stands at Israel's side, but has changed nothing about the fact that, despite sanctions, the Federal Republic of Germany remains the most important Western supporter of the Iranian regime to this day. No one in post-war Germany wants to say with any certainty how great the secret admiration is for the anti-West rage of the Iranian regime. On the contrary, what the majority of Germans think of Israel, the state upon which the rulers in Tehran wish death, has been well known for many years. In 2003, 65% of Germans considered Israel to be the greatest threat to world peace, at the same level of threat, that is, of North Korea, and distinctly ahead of Iran. According to a 2008 BBC poll, 77% of the population exhibited a negative attitude toward Israel, a more negative outcome than in the case of either North Korea or Iran. In 2004, over half of Germans declared that, quote, what the state of Israel is doing with the Palestinians today is principally no different than what the Nazis did with the Jews in the Third Reich, end quote. Almost 70% believe that Israel is carrying out a, quote, war of annihilation against the Palestinians, end quote. In this context, it should not be surprising that Israel, by its very existence, reminds Germans and Austrians of Dachau, Mauthausen, Auschwitz, and Treblinka. This expression of guilt defensiveness that critical theory terms secondary anti-Semitism is one of the main features of German attacks on Israel. In Austria, the situation is in some respects even worse. While 59% of EU citizens consider Israel the greatest danger for world peace at the time of the Second Intifada, in Austria, that statistic was 69%. In 2011, 42% of Austrians thought that Israelis acted, quote, just as inhumanely to the Palestinians as the Nazis once did to the Jews, end quote. This Israel-related anti-Semitism correlates with classical hostility towards Jews. 43% of Austrians hold the Jews accountable for the current financial crisis. Their delusional projections are topped currently only by Hungary, which ranks in first place with 46%, only 3% higher than Austria. In 2011, 44% of Austrians thought that, quote, In 2011, 44% of Austrians thought that the Jews, not the Jules, ruled the business world, end quote. A finding that can be considered great progress in the country. In 1986, when Kurt Waldheim of the ÖVP party campaigned for the Austrian presidency, it was 64%. So there's a 24% decrease in hostility towards Israel, or the Jews. That was 20%. Sorry, I'm just going to reread that whole thing. In 2011, 44% of Austrians thought that, quote, the Jews ruled the business world, end quote. A finding that can be considered great progress in that country. In 1986, when Kurt Waldheim of the Österreichische Volkspartei campaigned for the Austrian presidency, it was 64%. Based on a discourse analysis of new coverage of Israeli military operations in the Gaza Strip in 2008 to 2009, the communications research specialist Maximilian Gottschalk concluded that not only had tabloids such as Kronenzeitung succumbed to the, quote, communication strategy calculations of Hamas, end quote, but the left-wing liberal newspaper, Der Standard, had too in such a way that anti-Zionism and, quote, exuberant Israel criticism, end quote, which spilled over into anti-Semitism, had become a normal part of, quote, public discourse in Austria, end quote, today. What Gottslich, concluded, using the Gaza War of 2008 to 2009 as a paradigm, has since been confirmed by the Media Monitoring Center for the Middle East, or MENA, which was founded in Vienna in 2011. Its daily comments on and analysis of Austrian news coverage of Israel can be considered a current validation of Gottslich's findings. According to him, numerous examples for that, quote, noxious mixture of various anti-Semitic and anti-Israel stereotypes, end quote, can be clearly placed into the category of anti-Semitic propaganda against Israel. He does not in any way limit himself to the usual suspects, but he also criticizes liberal opinion makers, such as columnist Hans Rauscher, who assailed Israel using terms such as, quote, aggressor, end quote, banana republic, end quote, ruthless occupying power, end quote, under the title, quote, Black Times for Israel's Friends, end quote. With such, quote, friends, end quote, Israel no longer has the need for enemies. The obviously anti-Israel attitudes held by a majority in Germany hardly affect the Middle Eastern policies of the German government. However, this is primarily the result of the special relationship with Israel that had been imposed upon Germany in the post-war period. The difference between German and Austrian post-Nazism can be clearly seen in both countries' relations to the Jewish state. Germany saw itself forced to generally support Israel when relevant issues arose in international bodies, and in fact it still widely does as long as such issues do not run counter to German economic interests. On the other hand, as a result of the pervasive fiction that Austria was the first victim of the Nazis, it has not only abstained in such votes, but even voted to the disadvantage of Israel, as when, quote, Palestine, end quote, was admitted to UNESCO at the end of 2011. While the Germans acted as if they suddenly loved Jews and wanted to provide for the well-being of the Jewish state because of genuine shame over Germany's history, Israelis act as if they believe Germans have turned into staunch campaigners against anti-Semitism. For Israel, it is naturally important to have a more or less dependable ally in Europe, in order to at least moderate anti-Israel decisions in international forums. In turn, by lending its partial support, Germany hopes to be able to act on the world stage without being hindered by the burdens of its history. This pragmatism, on both sides, however, has never prevented the heir of the Nazi legacy from issuing one brazen statement after another. The first post-war chancellor, Konrad Adenauer of the CDU, indicated that one of the reasons for the so-called Wiedergutmachung reparations was his claim of 1965 that one should not underestimate, quote, the power of the Jews even today, and in America in particular, end quote. During Willy Brandt's SPD term, his foreign minister, Walter Scheel, Freie Demokratische Partei, FDP, tried to prevent U.S. arms deliveries via Germany to Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Helmut Schmidt called Menahem Begin, quote, a danger for world peace, end quote. Helmut Kohl, CDU, broke the international isolation of the Austrian federal president Kurt Waldheim, who had a past as a Wehrmacht officer and visited the Iranian regime as the first Western head of state in 1991, placing a wreath on the sarcophagus of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, quote, honored, end quote, the German Wehrmacht by placing a photo of his uniformed father on his desk. I'm going to assume that his father was in the Wehrmacht during World War II. I can't be certain of that. The Wehrmacht being the German army, I guess, if people aren't familiar with some of these words. Nevertheless, the notion of the special relationship continues to be cited. Remarkably, then, the German Bundestag was the sole European parliament to unanimously adopt a resolution against the sanctions of the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, after the Israeli army disrupted the so-called Gaza Freedom Flotilla in the summer of 2010. A resolution approved unanimously by all parties of Vienna's City Council in the summer of 2010 on a like subject represents a kind of provincial political complement to the German parliamentary decision. The latter can be seen as a step toward a break-in post-National Socialist normality, in which the ever-asserted, quote, obligation, end quote, to Israel is one of the last visible remains of the German memory of guilt. Today in Germany, and also in Austria from a different perspective, the remnants of National Socialism manifest themselves no longer in the threat of fascistic mass marches or in a classical historical revisionism, but in the appeasement of Islamic jihadists and in the delegitimization of Zionism. This is a delegitimization that is articulated in the political mainstream as a criticism of Israel's resolute self-defense. At the same time, the frontal attack on the Jewish state is generally left to Islamists, Nazis, and allegedly radical left-wingers. In the decades after 1945, it was the left wing that transformed the dictum, quote, never again Auschwitz, never again war, end quote, where, quote, war, end quote, meant German aggression and war of annihilation, into that of, quote, never again war against anti-Semitism, end quote. However, after Israel has been reportedly forced to wage war, after Israel has been repeatedly forced to wage war, this dogma has become one of the key justifications for delegitimizing Zionism. This leads to the absurd conclusion that, as a lesson learned from National Socialism, criticism of Israel's military posture is called for. The state of Shoah survivors and their offspring, as their tenant would have it, is obliged to seek security through peaceful means only. The Iranian threat and the delegitimization of Israel. The German-language discussion of the Islamic Republic of Iran repeatedly asserts that the Iranian regime is being, quote, demonized, end quote. In Austria, Georg Hoffmann Ostenhoff, former international policy editor at Austria's most important weekly newspaper, labeled the criticism of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, quote, hysteria, end quote. Gudrun Harrer, international policy editor at a left-liberal Austrian daily, employs the term, quote, Iranophobia, end quote. used by the Iranian regime to delegitimize any criticism delegated against the Islamic Revolution and law in Iran. On days of remembrance, such as November 9th or January 27th, representatives of nearly all political factions in Austria and Germany fully condemn their country's National Socialist past. But criticism of contemporary anti-Semitism, in contemporary anti-Semitism's Islamic and Iranian form, is scarcely heard during such commemorative events. In today's Austria and Germany, only dead Jews are commemorated, while there is no expression of solidarity with the Jewish state as it faces a lethal threat from Iran. Leading political analysts in Germany have been calling for dialogue or even, quote, strategic partnership, end quote, with the Iranian regime and allied jihadist groups such as Hamas or Hezbollah. Today, it is simple to find culprits among the lunatic fringe. For example, the Austrian Trotskyist League of the Socialist Revolution, which is known as the Workers' Power Group in Germany, and was the predecessor of the Revolutionary Communist Organization for Liberation, declaims, quote, for the right of Iran to establish and utilize nuclear facilities for peaceful as well as for military means, exclamation point, end quote. For the military defense of Iran against imperialist aggression, exclamation point, end quote. In the political mainstream, Muriel Asselberg, a Middle East expert at a think tank that advises the German government and parliament on foreign policy, regards, quote, the present policy of isolation towards Iran, end quote, as, quote, counterproductive, end quote. Volker Perthes, head of the most influential think tank in Germany, pursued the same approach and demands consideration of the, quote, interest and of all relevant actors, end quote, in the conflict with Iran. In Austria, Georg Hoffmann Ostenhoff speaks of the, quote, legitimate security interest, end quote, of the Islamic Republic, as does Michael Luders, a leading German expert on the Middle East. This language, originating in the realist school of international relations, turns the character of the Iranian regime into a complete abstraction. It pretends that Iran is just another state, akin to Iceland or Ireland, say, and not an Islamo-fascist dictatorship, whose founder openly stated that his interpretation of Islam, which is driven by anti-Semitism, called for global domination. And still influential voices in Austria and Germany systematically repudiate the menace that emanates from this dictatorship and this dictatorship's nuclear program. Christoph Bertram, who used to head the most important German think tank for international and security affairs, declared, quote, the danger of a nuclear-armed Iran would be manageable, end quote. End quote. The contemporary development amounts neither to a clear nor to an immediate danger, end quote. The Austrian political expert Gerhard Mangat also argues that a nuclear-armed Iran would present no existential threat to Israel. These authors exemplify an entire block of scholars. The pronouncements routinely appear in the most important Austrian and German media, and they strongly influence the discussion on the Iranian regime there. Their main argument for an all-clear signal regarding Iranian nuclear weapons implies that the military deterrence capability of Israel and its assumed arsenal of nuclear weaponry would even contain an Iranian regime in possession of such weapons. According to their views, Iran is a rational actor who would never employ a nuclear bomb. Many participants in the German language discussion underestimate the concurrence of pragmatism and irrationality that characterizes the Iranian regime. Further, the apocalyptic and messianic elements of the Iranian ideology go unheeded. The same holds true in regard to the ideology of martyrdom. In German and Austrian discussions, the Tehran rulers frequently figure on the same level as authoritarian regimes such as Russia or Algeria. Very few authors in either country discuss the specific danger inherent in the Iranian regime, one that results from its combination of apocalyptic martyrdom, anti-Semitism, and aspirations to perfect the technology of mass destruction. In addition, these authors ignore the fact that Iran would not have to use nuclear weapons to endanger Israel's existence and to change the rules of the game of international relations in favor of Islamic jihadism. The Iranian bomb, in contrast to the assumed Israel nuclear weapons, would lead to a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. The Austrian and German discussions rarely mention the consequences of an Iranian bomb that Yossi Klein Halevi and Michael Oren outlined in The New Republic. Quote, "No Arab partner will be able to make concessions to Israel with a nuclear Iran standing over them. Israel will find its military options severely limited. Foreign investors will flee the country, and many Israelis will too. In one poll, 27% of Israelis said they would consider leaving if Iran went nuclear," end quote. Oren and Halevi summarize, quote, "The promise of Zionism to create a Jewish refuge will have failed, and instead Jews will see the diaspora as a more trustworthy option for both personal and collective survival," end quote. Instead of taking such prognoses seriously, leading German and Austrian political analysts and commentators advise Israel to resign itself to a nuclear-armed Iran. Iranian threats of annihilation against Israel, they contend, are mere rhetoric, intended to serve, quote, internal purposes," end quote. Only a means employed by the regime to distract from economic and social problems. It escapes these opinion leaders' attention that anti-Semitism does not just represent one tactic among others, it lies at the ideological core of Islamic jihadism. In respect to the threats of annihilation against Israel, such authors suggest that, quote, "a solution," end quote, to the Middle East conflict, or an improvement of the situation of the Palestinians would end Iran's lethal threats. On the one hand, these explanations ignore that the entire Iranian regime calls for the extermination of Israel. Few articles in Germany and Austria mention precisely such utterances by the strongman of Iran, the supreme leader Ali Khamenei. They also fail to take into account that, in regard to the Middle East conflict, the Iranian regime has no interest whatsoever in improving the situation of the Palestinians. It also displays no disposition toward a compromise settlement or even a two-state solution, but rather promotes and pursues the, quote, "liberation of the whole of Palestine," end quote, a euphemism for the annihilation of the Jewish state. These activities started not with Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's presidency, but with the Islamic Revolution in 1979. As David Mishari put it, quote, "Iran's attitude to Israel was one of the rare examples of adherence to dogma," end quote. The concurrence of pragmatism and irrationality led to a kind of flip-flopping in many areas of politics over the last 3 decades, but never when it comes to the slogan, Marg bar Israel, death to Israel. In sum, the German and Austrian perceptions of the Islamic Republic of Iran show both the trivialization of the anti-Semitic character of the regime by downplaying the threats of the Iranian nuclear program to Israel and the West, and this an aspect worthy of further detailed investigation, ignoring those voices of the secular opposition in Iran and in exile who oppose such trivializations. Why is this kind of perception of the Iranian regime flourishing throughout Austria and Germany? First, Austria and Germany are pursuing economic and political goals through their policy towards Iran. Second, present within various sectors of public opinion in the media and even within the political arena, a certain level of naivety regarding Islamist ideology predominates. Obviously, displeasure associated with confronting a serious threat and thereby bringing about unwanted consequences exists. This is discernible in the comparatively reluctant course of action against Islamist organizations within Austria and Germany. Third, because the utterly skewed perception of the Middle Eastern conflict always perceives Israel as the troublemaker. It colors the perception of the Iranian regime. Public opinion in Austria and Germany is more than willing to take the statements of Iranian politicians and clerics who aim to see Israel exterminated as essentially justifiable criticism of Israeli behavior toward the Palestinians, and explain away the more candid statements as, quote, translation issues, end quote. Beyond superficial amendments to their Iran policies, indications of a substantial change have yet to emerge. Austria and Germany, the successor states of National Socialism, still oblige the Iranian regime through economic cooperation and policies of appeasement. Despite the threats emanating from the Iranian regime, Germany remains Iran's most important trading partner in the West. Since the election of Hassan Rouhani and the disastrous nuclear agreement made in Geneva in November 2013, the situation has become even worse. Rouhani, who can be best described as the friendly face of terror, was first characterized as, quote, a moderate, end quote. Now even papers like Der Standard refer to Rouhani as a, quote, liberal reformist, end quote. The German Tageszeitung called Rouhani a, quote, bearded bearer of hope with heart, end quote. Through nuclear negotiations with the Iranian regime and the Geneva Agreement, with a shrug of its shoulders, Germany has also made clear that it is ignoring the massive concern of Israel with regard to a nuclear-armed Iran. And again, Germany and Austria are at the forefront when it comes to making billions through trade and the sworn trade with, And again, Germany and Austria are at the forefront when it comes to making billions through trade with the sworn enemy of Israel. Their relentless will to accept a dangerous compromise with the Iranian regime expresses a desire that is as naive as it is enterprising. The ominous development quite pleases European lobbyists for trade with Iran. The Austrian energy giant OMV sought to conclude a 22 billion euro trade agreement with the Iranian regime even during Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's presidency, but had to put it on hold after massive criticism from the Israeli and the U.S. governments, as well as from the European coalition Stop the Bomb, which campaigns for effective economic and political sanctions against the Iranian regime. Now, however, OMV is back in the starting gates, as is German industry. The Austrian Chamber of Commerce, which also tried its best to explain to Austrian companies during Ahmadinejad's presidency how they could do huge business with the anti-Semitic regime in Tehran, despite all of the sanctions, sent a large delegation to Iran in November 2013. In late February 2014, the same institution began a new campaign with a day-long seminar in Vienna to encourage companies to take up business that the rulers in Iran urgently need in order to continue their projects and stay in power. The German-Iranian Chamber of Commerce in Hamburg held a similar seminar only a day later. Hassan Rouhani and his foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif are exactly the right men at the right time for the Iranian regime to achieve its endeavors with regard to the nuclear operation. For Germany and Austria, which have both maintained very close economic and political ties to the dictatorship of the Ayatollahs, the election of the allegedly, quote, moderate, end quote, Rouhani conveniently excused them from undertaking any serious steps against the Iranian regime. Thus, Israel finds itself threatened by a dangerous compromise with respect to the Iranian nuclear program, negotiated with the significant involvement of German and Austrian diplomats, namely Helga Schmidt and Stephan Clement. This confirms to the Jewish state that it must prepare for the possibility of being on its own should it need to act against Iranian nuclear armament. Delegitimization and post-nationalism. Those on the political left who contribute to delegitimizing the Jewish state operate within a distinct theoretical framework. The concepts upon which they draw for their anti-Israel project merit scrutiny, particularly since in the last 20 years, anti-Zionist thinking has been subject to change. During the last decades of the Cold War, from the late 1960s until the collapse of the Soviet bloc at the beginning of the 1990s, anti-imperialist, quote, nationalism of liberation, end quote, as Marxist-Leninist thought puts it, was its main point of reference. In the past 2 decades, an abstract anti-nationalism has emerged that is strongly influenced by certain anarchist theoretical traditions with roots in post-structuralism. It has become the primary legitimization of anti-Zionism and strongly influences the political mainstream through the social sciences, which are currently occupied with post-national constellations. The Nazis declared that the Jews were incapable of establishing a, quote, true state, end quote. The core National Socialist writing on Zionism stems from Adolf Hitler's senior philosopher, Alfred Rosenberg. He claimed that the project of founding a Jewish state was in itself, quote, adverse to statehood, end quote. The Führer, too, maintained that the Jews were incapable of, quote, building a state in a spatially perceived manner, end quote, due to their, quote, lack of productive capability, end quote. During the 1970s and 1980s, this doctrine resonated among the left, with the Arab nationalist and later Islamist condemnation of Israel as a, quote, artificial creation, end quote. But today, Zionist Jews are accused of stubbornly clinging to their allegedly obsolete concept of nationhood. In recent years, Europe's post-nationalism has been elevated to an intellectual virtue. Israel embodies national self-determination as an answer to anti-Semitism from its founding until today. The Jewish state constantly reminds Europe in general, and the successor states of National Socialist Germany in particular, why Jewish national self-determination is necessary. In recent years, debates about post-nationalism and blindness to resurgent anti-Semitism have led to calls on Israel to overcome its, quote, outdated nationalistic ideology, end quote. Among others, the late influential scholar Tony Judt, who is also widely read in Austria and Germany, described Israel as a, quote, anachronism, end quote, and declared that there is, quote, no place, end quote, for a Jewish state. Although the persistence of anti-Semitism remains one of the strongest arguments for the necessity of Zionism and a strong Jewish state, it comes as no surprise that the trivialization and even denial of contemporary European and Islamic anti-Semitism has become central to both demonizing and delegitimizing Israel. In both Germany and Austria, Jewish and Israeli leftist parties played key roles in the delegitimization campaigns. In Austria, the political scientist John Bunzel is a major inspirer of anti-Israel sentiment. Most recently in Germany, drawing on Martin Buber's objections to early statehood, Mika Brumlich played a key role in making the, quote, one-state solution, end quote, that is, the dissolution of Israel into a binational state, acceptable again. In the 1960s, both Brumlich and Bunzel had been members of the Israeli Matz Pen group, which was calling for the, quote, quote, the de-Zionization, end quote, of Israel. However, significant differences also... One second. Sorry about that. In the 1960s, both Brumlich and Bunzel had been members of the Israeli Matz Pen group, which was calling for the, quote, de-Zionization, end quote, of Israel. However, significant differences also separate the two. While Bunzel eagerly gave interviews to Iranian regime media even during the presidency of Ahmadinejad and campaigned for European political leaders' contact with Hamas, despite Brumlich's harsh criticism of Israel, he has taken a clear position against the rulers of Tehran and their allies on Israel's border, such as Hamas and Hezbollah. Further important sources of inspiration for the left-wing delegitimization of Israel in Germany and Austria include anti-Zionist activist and author and former Matz Pen member Michael Warshawski, as well as Moshe Zuckerman, who has opposed Israeli policies numerous times in both countries, and nearly all of whose books have been released in German. Zuckerman opposes a doctrine of universalism to the particularism of Zionism, inappropriately drawing on Adorno for scholarly, philosophical, and theoretical support. Compared to Warshawski and his like, he represents a sort of, quote, moderate anti-Zionism, end quote, that fits much better into the German debate than to open calls for the destruction of the Jewish state. As a consequence, he plays an especially decisive role in discrediting Israel. Currently, the reception of Judith Butler commands lively interest in German and Austrian debates, not only on the left or among left-wing radicals, especially after she received the renowned Theodor W. Adorno Prize from the city of Frankfurt am Main in 2012. The enthusiasm for Butler raises a series of questions, not only with regard to her anti-Zionism. Why should an author who favors U.S. gender scholar Leila Abu Laghad's praise of the burqa be recognized as a paragon of feminism? According to Judith Butler, Abu Lughad sees, quote, important cultural meanings of the burqa, end quote. In Precarious Life, published in German in 2005, Butler draws on Abu Lughad's protest against the, quote, decimation of Islamic culture, end quote, and the, quote, extension of U.S. cultural assumptions about how sexuality and agency ought to be organized and represented, end quote, in an attempt to denounce pictures of non-veiled Afghan girls and women. Veiling should be understood, Abu Lughad declares, as, quote, an exercise of modesty and pride, end quote, and serves as, quote, a veil behind which and through which feminine agency can and does work, end quote. Butler declares any critical view of the Islamist terroristic opposition, Butler declares any critical view of the Islamist terroristic imposition of, quote, virtues, end quote, to be a, quote, culturally imperialist exploitation of feminism, end quote. The fitting answer to this kind of cultural relativism was given in 1979 by those exceptionally brave women who demonstrated for weeks against forced veiling in Khomeini's Iran under the slogan of, quote, emancipation is not Western, emancipation is not Eastern, emancipation is universal, end quote. Those of Butler's followers who still take feminism seriously found it hard to turn a blind eye to statements that clearly nullify the universal idea of freedom. Something similar took place when the city of Frankfurt am Main awarded Butler the Adorno Prize. During the debate stirred by her anti-Israeli statements, the Frankfurt jury and many of Butler's German admirers tried to defend her by claiming that she had only attacked the continuous settlement building and other specific actions of the Israeli government. If this defense strategy was hardly stable then, after the publication of Butler's Parting Ways in 2012, it completely collapsed. Translated into German in 2013, the book starts with the grand delusion that the allegedly omnipotent community of Israel defenders will stigmatize as anti-Semitic. Translated into German in 2013, Butler's Parting Ways starts with the grand delusion that the allegedly omnipotent community of Israel defenders will stigmatize as anti-Semitic all anti-Zionists who portray themselves as victims of merciless persecution. For Butler, the fact that there have always been Jewish opponents of Zionism confirms her own opposition to Israel, which she asserts takes courage to express. She cites Jewish criticism of Zionism by Hermann Cohen, Franz Rosenzweig, or Hannah Arendt in order to justify her opposition to Israel. Quoting the Shoah survivor Primo Levi's protest against the Lebanon War of 1982, Butler tries to justify her extreme disapproval of the Zionist project. Against this background, like her ideological ally, Edward Said, she aims at nothing less than the abolition of Israel. Unsurprisingly, her Jewish witnesses to the evils of Zionism are not radical enough for Butler. The binational proposals of Hannah Arendt, Martin Buber, Judah Magnus, quote, did not go far enough, end quote, she remonstrates. Butler demands a, quote, dismantling of political Zionism, end quote, and the, quote, dismantling of the structure of Jewish sovereignty, end quote. Thus, Butler argues for the abolition of the law of return, which guarantees all Jews the right to immigrate to Israel, and the implementation of the, quote, right of return, end quote, for Palestinians, which would spell doom for Israel as a Jewish state. In Parting Ways, Butler advances her passionate defamation of Israel's legitimacy by supporting the BDS movement, as she has for many years, a fact always downplayed by her German and Austrian supporters. Meanwhile, even radical defamers of Israel, Noam Chomsky and Norman Finkelstein, have backed off from the BDS movement. Butler clarifies that her aim is not only to boycott products from West Bank settlements, but to boycott the state of Israel totally. Anything less would mean giving up the Palestinian, quote, claims of 1948, end quote, and their, quote, right of return, end quote. Butler's objectives are unmistakable. Like Ali Khamenei's, the Sunnite Islamists, and the PFLPs, albeit with a different vision of future cohabitation in that region, Butler's concern is the, quote, liberation, end quote, of, quote, Palestine, end quote, in its entirety. Thus, she even strongly disagrees with left-wing versions of Zionism. Butler's objections to Zionism provide any type of person in Austria and Germany who hates Israel, mostly pseudo-critical liberals, with ample ammunition. They delight in the set of notions and the pretentious language of the post-structural mastermind. Her book is another milestone along the course of delegitimizing and ultimately destroying Israel. Unless I am mistaken, Butler's fans in Austria and Germany, who claimed during the Adorno Prize debate that her polemics were confined to Israel's presence in the West Bank, should find themselves with little ground left. The professor of rhetoric and comparative literature points out, quote, "It is important to note that for Said and for my own argument here, binationalism leads not to a two-state solution, but to a single state," end quote. Butler ignores not only the current resurgence of anti-Semitism in Europe, but the entire history that led to the founding of the State of Israel. For Butler, the displacement of Palestinians in 1948 did not result from a decades-long conflict essentially fueled by Arab anti-Semitism, and was not the outcome of a war triggered by the Arab-Palestinian axis, but rather it was due to the nature of Zionism. Butler says nothing about the displacement of some 800,000 Jews originating from Arab countries. The history of Arab anti-Semitism and Israel's constant threat from the Iranian regime are never mentioned within the 250 pages of Parting Ways, not to speak of the anti-Jewish rage of Hamas or Hezbollah, which Butler takes for, quote, progressive, end quote, part of a global left, end quote. Undisturbed by facts, Butler erases 100 years of Middle Eastern conflict, which her self-defined ethics of Undisturbed by facts, she erases 100 years of Middle Eastern conflict with her self-defined ethics of conviction, while gangs of jihadist murderers find place as allies in her fight against Israel. I don't know why I said murderers, it says killers, but anyway, jihadist killers. Not only in her defense of the burqa, but in her radical verdict on Zionism as well, Butler refers to Lila Abu Lughad and her struggle against something she calls, quote, Jewish exceptionalism, end quote. In the main, Butler mobilizes an abstract and ahistorical universalism against what she sees as Zionist particularism. Her universalistic pseudo-morality easily gives way to crude cultural relativism, as can be seen, for example, in her earlier noted apology for veiling. She not only fails to recognize the tension between particularism and universalism, which has always been present in various manifestations of Judaism, but she also ignores the decades-long debate among various strains of Zionist thought regarding separatism, cosmopolitanism, universalistic aspirations, and necessarily particularistic practice. Butler and her entourage refuse to see that Zionist particularism, despite diverging tendencies within the Zionist movement, has been imposed by hostility from without and was not voluntarily chosen. Whoever opposes it must address the root of the problem, the anti-Semitism that Butler fuels with her own variety of, quote, Jewish exceptionalism, end quote. Whatever she refuses Israel, whether it be sovereignty, nationalism, or safeguarding of territories, despite her post-nationalistic notions, Butler freely grants the Palestinians. The substance of their political intentions and their nationalism go unmentioned, as if these were uncharted waters and beyond reproach. Her uncritical alignment with the cause of quote, Palestine, end quote, her uncritical alignment with the cause of, quote, Palestine, end quote, reveals the intimacy of her anti-nationalist political theory with barbarism. Not only Butler, but still other key actors in the delegitimation campaign come from the left. However, in Austria and Germany especially, a clear split among the left has emerged. There, some of the most outspoken defenders of Israel and strongest critics of delegitimation come from the left wing, especially from the radical left wing. This split is also reflected in their theoretical positions. To put it simply, those who base their views on critical theory lean toward defending Zionism as a necessary response to anti-Semitism, while the proponents of post-structuralism and post-colonial theory lean toward defending the so-called legitimate rights of the Palestinians and towards attacking the legitimacy of Israel and Zionism. Adorno wrote that, quote, "A new categorical imperative has been imposed by Hitler upon unfree mankind, to arrange their thoughts and actions so that Auschwitz will not repeat itself, so that nothing similar will happen again." End quote. If the left were to take the categorical imperative of Adorno seriously, it would have to be on the front line fighting against the delegitimation of Israel, against the threats emanating from the Iranian regime, and against the support of the Ayatollahs by Austrian and German companies, politicians, and scholars. Unfortunately, we are miles away from that fight in both countries, as well as globally.